Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we discuss, is the death penalty more humane than life imprisonment? Tim.
Today I'm going to defend the death penalty, not because it's necessary, I think it's just per se, but in a way it's necessary if society in general needs / has punishment. We discussed this maybe 50 episodes ago. This is our 99th episode in punishment theory. What can one do to someone who does something heinous? In conservative Panglossian fashion, the death penalty, I'm going to argue, is the best possible punishment available of the existing possible punishments. There are a couple of reasons one might engage in punishments such as justice, deterrence, and isolation. Lifetime incarceration may meet these qualifications, but has a number of problems which I'll discuss below. The inmate could murder the guard or fellow inmate, but that fellow inmate is also a criminal too, and the guard knows what he got himself into. A guard, in a sense, it's less heinous for a police and again, as we discussed, Anabaptist would have some sort of defense agency. So if you think one doesn't need punishment, that is fine. You take the prison abolition position or the punishment abolition position, but as long as it starts to later codex format, you start with the actual outgroup committing a murder of an in-group or protected class. So like if you're a progressive, think someone like some school shooter. If you want to go that guy, think of some of the person, your actual enemy, and think of him committing a crime against someone who is a protected class. That group, start with that. Then I want to hear the prison abolition, punishment abolition case, not on the weak cases, because in those cases, most of the people on the left don't generally think they're actually committing crime. I think that in an ideal society, if you got rid of these things wouldn't happen. Maybe not. I do think a free society would have heinous crimes. Paradoxically, the rarer they are, the more heinous they might be on a psychological level. There is an argument made by certain center-right people in the United States that actually crime is way very low, and that these sort of quote-unquote mass shootings are very rare anyway. I actually agree with that argument in general. They are fairly rare. Ladders, shark attacks actually might, in a way, than the stereotypical things. And if you look in there, it's actually gang violence, so to speak, having drive-by shootings. That's more of what it actually is than these random ones. Of course, you go into Alex Jones' theory too, but we'll just take the mainstream definition for now. So again, in a free ideal society, I think there will be crime. Now, this is sort of a theological point here, but I think even an atheist sort of has to make this. I do think it would happen in a free society with people whose wills are free and not entirely pure, or the rules aren't entirely pure. Again, this is a theological argument here, but if one is murdering someone because they are enforcing passively or actively an impure rule, or a part of a system of impure rules and exploitation, defined whatever way you want, then in a sense it's not technically murder. Right? This is a lot of left-wing arguments to defend all sorts of things, from 9/11 to various other murders and thefts. They'll just say they're crimes of opportunity, or they're actually crimes of justice. And the right will do this too, of course. If you're doing self-defense and you shoot somebody, by certain ethical systems, you're actually engaged in murder. But in other ethical systems, you actually engage in self-defense, and it's necessary. The thief who steals and feeds himself is the common example. This is why the left anarchists don't really care about Walmart being attacked by BLM. Now, if they attack the store clerks, they might be a bother somewhat. But even so, it's just, quote-unquote, to use the Orwellian phrase, collateral damage. So if a heinous crime exists, you need a heinous punishment. So which is more humanistic, the death penalty or life in prison? Well, the first question one must ask is, how brutal is the prison? Because the prison can isolate people. That's one of the benefits. You don't get repeat serial killers if they're in prison, because they're sort of like incapacitated, so to speak. If the prison isn't sufficiently brutal, then it isn't a punishment. It's actually a reward. I think a lot of parents have this problem where they punish their children with what in effect is rewards. I think schools have this problem too. Is sending a student home really a punishment? We're not really sure. Julian Assange, for example, is clearly being subjected to the worst life in prison condition. That is the point. Again, this is not the formal purpose, but this is the actual purpose. If one has prisons that are fairly humane, in a sense, they aren't punishment. Arguably, this is what progressives try to do in theory. Iceland has this kind of prison system. It's very minimum security. Although you could argue Iceland is this sort of mono-ethnic Nordic society that doesn't really have much of a bad history. Everyone gets along. You can make all those arguments. It has lots of welfare and things like that. You can make all those arguments. I'm well aware. So you might argue that's a deal study. But they do have very minimum security prison. They don't really meet the justice qualification. So if someone does something that's really bad, you need justice. This is where sort of natural law or vengeance kicks in, where when people like go shoot up a whole family that's obviously innocent. We're not talking about abortion. We're not talking about the edge cases where it's considered political, or it's political in a way that the society thinks most people think it's bad. This is where you can get mob justice too. This is arguably where the state or the courts are actually a protective thing. So the other thing that's often brought up for this life in prison, the death penalty is cheaper. The death penalty is cheaper unless you get the prisoners to labor. Interestingly, the common objection with some libertarians and liberals who make to mass incarceration being expensive is probably false. And the reason it's false is the classical reason, prison labor. Jimmy Dore pointed out this with respect to California Democrats. California is using prison labor to fight its record wildfires. Any Roman or any medieval person would just call or any like Persian would call, oh wow, this is just completely normal. You're using prisoners to fight a very dangerous, arduous job. That's a great thing. The USSR did this. The Soviet gold gulags. It's sort of the perfect. You feed them 1,300 calories a day, you can extract them. The German Wehrmacht did this to Soviet prisoners too. They have the exact calories. They last like 2 years, and they're dead. So maybe there's some sort of way to pump people out. But I argue again, this is inhumane in a sense. This is arguably is inhumane. But again, perpetual niceness is a problem, and perpetual not having niceness. So it doesn't seem that mass incarceration is particularly humane either, depending on how nice it is. And if it's too nice, well, then is it really a punishment? And then why even keep them in, other than for the reason of isolation? And you have to pay for it too. And the they is the society. And this ideal society, whether this be Anabaptist or Chomsky would have to sort of fund this operation. So in my opinion, I think the death penalty is quick. It gets done quickly, and it's done. So Swithin, what would you make of my argument here? Prison labor or death penalty? Which is worse? Because really, the nice prison isn't really a prison at all, which is fine. It isolates the person. They can't repeat kill them. But it's not really a punishment, which could be good. But it seems like punishments, people want to punish their enemy here. You can go into theological realms. You can go into sort of justice realms. You can go whatever way you want, or pragmatic realms. What do you make of that, Chris Swithin?
It's an interesting question, because on the one hand, I tend to hear anti-capital punishment advocates going, oh no, the death penalty is inhumane, is barbarous. And then at the same time, they'll make the argument that, oh yeah, but they'll get off too quick, life in prison is much worse. And it's like, well, surely then life in prison is more barbaric then, surely. I mean, why is execution that much? Why is that significantly worse? So there seems to be a lot of cognitive dissonance going on. And in a way, you could make the case that the death penalty is sort of more humane in a sense. Because a lot of people think, well, hang on, well, if you're just going to kill them, it's like, well, that was a bit quick. Especially if you're just going to get like a lethal injection. It's like, that's not really much of a punishment. This was a line touted by one of the characters in a very good film I rewatched recently called The Secret in Their Eyes, which is an Argentinian film from 2009. And one of the characters, his wife is raped and murdered. And he's like, He was asking the cops, what punishment do you get? And it's like, well, we don't have the death penalty. So our death penalty would be too good. What are you going to do? Are they are they just going to be, if they did have it, they'd just sort of like be executed and be done with it. And it's like, no, a life should be a life. It should be for like the whole life kind of sentence, as it were. That was his view, which is of course interesting. Which then of course begs the question: well, you mentioned there's the type of prison, but then there's also the type of execution, because one could make execution significantly more painful than is currently exercised in the US at present. You could clearly torture them beforehand and then butcher them in slow and painful ways. So there are ways in which you could crank up the pain if you wanted to. Now, would that be more humane is another question. It does seem to be the case. I think if you're in prison and you're in isolation, then that's definitely very bad. Having unless you are like super autiste, people tend to want to talk to other people. And so if you're in sort of like solitary confinement, that's pretty darn bad, especially if you're there for, well, let's say forever. So there are ways of making it better and worse, as you mentioned. It does seem to be the case. I mean, another film reference point here. In Shawshank Redemption, film from 1994, that prison, the guards and the prison system is portrayed very badly, but the inmates actually do quite well in prison. Well, actually, they seem to like each other to some extent. I do think that's probably a bit a rosier view than probably exists, but they create some sort of community. And actually, one of the problems with prison probably isn't whole life terms to a large extent, but when they're released, is that, well, they're just not suited to civilian society, and people who were respected in the prison system because they had various skills which were recognized there and sort of like hierarchy and had some sort of importance. It was kind of like just got rid of in there, and so coming back to civilian life is somewhat difficult. Now, you did mention prison labor to make it prison system relatively not that expensive. I think in the UK, for instance, the average cost of keeping someone incarcerated was about £20,000, so about $30,000 a year. So prison labor can help to do with that. Although, in a way, imagine that I suppose Elon Musk was in, and no, I'm not accusing him for anything for the record. It's supposing that he was like convicted of multiple murders or something. Would it really make sense to get him to go and fight wildfires in California? If you wanted to extract much monetary value from him to compensate the families of the victims, surely you'd want him to work on some sort of tech project. And then that gets an interesting question. If you really want to maximize sort of like your returns from them, prison, well, on the one hand, might not be that bad for them as it were in a way, although then the big question is one of motivation in that circumstance, because what motivations do you have to work particularly hard? I mean, because if you just keep in bare subsistence in prison or some sort of like sort of secure residence indentured servant, he's not going to have much motivation to achieve his goals. Another alternative which you didn't mention, which has been suggested, and Keith Preston mentioned this to me in the past. He said, well, one way you could deal with murderers, or if they're convicted or whatever, was basically to have like basically a penal colony, and just go, everybody's convicted of bad crime, just lump them all over here. And then basically, I think essentially, if they could somehow prove that it wasn't them and they had like a retrial or something, they'd be allowed back into sort of like civilized society. Although it would be interesting to see what such a society would be like. It'd be like a more like autonomous prison, as it were, which might have some interesting results. Although obviously, if inmates kill each other, is that really a good idea? And if the goal was to prevent miscarriages of justice such that someone wasn't executed unjustly, well, in this case, by unjust, I mean they haven't committed the crime they were alleged to have committed. and that was like a fail-safe, so that if they were eventually found not guilty, they could come back to civilized society. Then, of course, going to some sort of penal colony like that wouldn't particularly work too well. So I do think if you're going to make prison a punishment or some sort of, well, see, one of the classic sort of libertarian arguments instead of sort of execution was basically lifetime indentured servitude, which is kind of alluded to anyway. And you might need a secure environment to take that place in so they don't abscond. I mean, that's entirely possible. But as I say, I think you have the problem of motivation. I mean, would they do it? And then would they perform that well to achieve their goal? And then, again, as you said, is it really that much of a punishment if they do that? Especially if you end up into a situation whereby you kind of have to allow them to keep quite a lot of the money they generate, otherwise don't produce much, but then they compensate their victims to a large extent, then that kind of seems less of a punishment than it might otherwise seem. Especially if you've got, like, as I say, abnormal individuals who've got high intelligence, and the way that they're going to generate a lot of income isn't by manual labor, which you can kind of make feel hard. It's more intellectual labor. That would then seem sort of less of a punishment. So those would be my sort of opening thoughts on the matter.
The what is punishment question here, and how humane could a punishment be with it being sufficiently punishing, is a good question here. I do think there's a sort of if you go to a sports game, they often have these things where they put a ball inside of 3 hats and they move it around, and then they try to guess which hats it's in. I do think in a way that they're sort of relying on momentum, right? Because a lot of prisons are quite minimum security. Actually, the inmates are the things that make it worse, right? Like they're designed to be not as onerous, although the inmates are the ones that make it worse. It's sort of the bureaucracy that makes it worse. So, but I do think it's running on momentum, because like you talk about, so what brings me to my second question: is the death penalty too humane? That's the argument you really get at here, because if your desire punishment, isn't a harsh prison worse than just hanging the person, it's over in a minute, or lethal injection? From my understanding, they you don't even notice. I could be wrong, but I think there's very humane ways to do it, or very non-painful ways to do it. So there is ways in which you could argue that it's actually too humane here. I mean, I think the Soviet gold mine gulags would arguably be worse, being sent to northern Siberia to mine gold for the regime here, just being underground in this dangerous job here. And I think your point about, I think you brought up the point about, like, if like some Elon Musk guy got convicted of murder here. I think there's a sort of manual labor is thought to be as part of the punishment as opposed to intellectual labor here. So I do think the idea of just putting them out, well, just let them do their normal job, they just have to pay higher tax rate. One of the problems with that will just make that, well, is everyone else technically in prison? If there's anyone who pays a sufficiently high tax rate, aren't they in prison in a way? So one of the problems with any labor system, the French had this system. This is one of the things Michel Foucault in Crime and Punishment points out, is that free laborers got sort of annoyed when the state started using prison labor because they were viewed as competitors to them. And this is another thing in the American Civil War. The free soilers didn't want the Southerners bringing their slaves out there because they wanted the land to farm themselves in the West. So it's sort of for strictly economic reasons. Penal labor is often thought of as a kind of punishment here, and that non-physical labor is viewed more as a choice. Now that's a kind of class, like, what is labor? Is labor a form of onerous punishment? By the way, this is one of the arguments, speaking of theology. If you go to Genesis here, the ground is made to be harder to plant stuff. This is the justification for scarcity here. It is part of this quote-unquote curse, so to speak. within Christianity here, and that's also, I think, in the other Abrahamic religions still rely on the same story too. So this covers much of the world here. This kind of labor is part of the punishment here. You argue it's a good thing here, so to speak. I think Solzhenitsyn would say that, you get, and the Japanese have very brutal prisons. They actually prefer working. At least you're considered doing something. You're not just locked in like a cage underground with no light for 23 and a half hours a day. So again, you could ask what institution would do this, and that's a good question here. And that's actually one of the reasons I say death penalty here. Because if you ask, if you were convicted of murder either correctly or incorrectly, which society would you pick? Well, I would pick one with death penalty because it would get it over with. It would just be done. You wouldn't have this long process here. You wouldn't have bureaucracy. In the United States, technically, they're supposed to be speedy. This is, again, where the bureaucracy is part of the punishment, arguably. It's supposed to happen within weeks, and actually in the old days, it used to happen in the weeks here. So I'd argue that's more humane than making a person wait for 8 years. Just get it over with. And they do make it more expensive, but again, that's arguably, that's the prison industrial complex here. And that's another thing that I think the death penalty cuts down on. It cuts down the desire for people to make money off prison labor here, which may increase the likelihood of crimes. This is actually one reason why I think, go back to the French example, why some societies want to do away with prison labor here, is because this is sort of a poison. It's sort of like a poison pill. It's like you'll get more of it. You'll go out and create criminals just so you can have free labor here. And I do think there's ways to design it that you get lots of value out. And like the firefighter example, that's necessary because many firefighters, the ones that do it, if they get injured or stuff like that, it's a kind of expensive job. It's a dangerous job. And then you have to sort of take care of their family after there. So, you're dealing with jobs that have high death rates like that. It's a very useful thing. It's a very necessary thing. I would imagine an ideal society would have to fight fires if wildfires happen. So, send them out there. Send them out to go, fix. So the types of jobs that they would pick are arguably part of the punishment here. So what do you make of my part two questions within here? The penal colony, I'll quick comment on that. You made a comment about penal colony. Again, where would the penal colony be located? There's a certain degree in which there's no barren land, so to speak, left. Maybe you can find some. Australia, of course, was this. The New World, in a way, was this historically for England. And that actually might work. But, you have to sort of find them. You could make them maybe within your society, have a certain county, pick a county. This is the prison colony here. But, you might get people wanting to move there. And then if this goes back to my ball trick here, if enough people want to move there, some people say, well, that's kind of not a punishment. You just murdered my wife and children, and you're sending into a place that many people are voluntarily going. That's not very just. Again, you could always go full philosophy. What's justice? Can the state have justice? Blah, blah, blah. I agree. However, if there's that desire, this is the point that I think Richard Epstein made on a comment with Econ Talk. If someone just murders an obviously innocent person and nothing's done about it, and everyone knows he did it, this is going to create a huge problem in the community here. Unless it's like an Anabaptist community. But here I would argue they're just sort of technical free riders here. Like there are certain groups that are sort of hyper forgiveness, but most people aren't that way. So that's my point. So question 2 is with them, which is, is the death penalty too humane? What do you make of that?
I certainly think. So just saying on the prison colony, I do think that's a potential issue with it. I do think it's kind of a weird. I don't think it worked too well, especially if it was in a society. You might end up going, oh no, you've got a prisoner who is trespassing. It's like, oh, they're in the normal land. Like, well, what can we do to them? Can we shoot them or something? And it's like, well, you may as well execute them anyway. So that'd be interesting to see what punishments you do. And then, of course, you might have to keep just deporting them. And then basically it's an immigration problem, which would be an interesting parallel there. But is the death penalty you meant? Well, in certain sense, yes, I think so. In that I do think you can reasonably make the case that certain crimes deserve more unpleasant forms of execution. I think that's be perfectly. I mean, so for instance, let's suppose someone killed someone by locking them in an industrial freezer, which, from what I understand, is a relatively pleasant way of going compared to something else. Whereas if someone tortured someone for like 3 months and starved them, gouged out their eyes, etc., and then killed them, I'd be like, well, I kind of think the second one's quite a lot worse than the first. So I do think that sort of that sort of straightforward execution is kind of too pleasant, especially with lethal injection. Maybe not hanging, or maybe so. So I do think you can certainly make the case for execution plus in certain circumstances. Now, as to what that should be is another question. And then about proportionality, etc. The classic example there is, how I suppose you're trying to be type proportional and kill them the way they killed somebody else. It's like, well, what if they rape somebody? It's like, well, you don't really want to get someone to rape them. And it's like, well, yeah, true, but you can, because of the impact on the person doing it, but you could kind of alter the punishment to some extent to sort of make it approximately even in a sense. So yeah, I think that's fair on execution. When it comes to, you're saying that one of the problems with prison labor, you encourage crime because people want to use the criminals, as it were. That's an interesting objection, because that's an objection I think was actually quite a good one to the application of Walter Block's two teeth to a tooth, which was Rothbard's.
Let me quick paraphrase. You encourage the regime or the Anabaptist Justice Department to find criminals who aren't really committing crimes per se, and just to go after them just so they have free labor. It's sort of like a tempting thing there. There's no control mechanism for them not to want. If too many people benefit from having free labor, then they'll just go out and just go find. They're basically finding slaves. That's kangaroo court. That's my point. But you're talking about Walter Block.
No, I think that is to some extent similar. What I was going to say with this is, one of the Block ones would be like, well, if you stole £1,000, what you need to do is to return the £1,000 plus another £1,000, because you're supposed to punish the criminal to the extent that they were going to try to punish you, plus extra costs of scaring or whatever, process fees or whatever. And an objection to that was, well, that just kind of encourages people to be the victim of crime, and effectively just encourages people to entrap everybody else because they know they can basically make a lot of money on doing so. Now, your point was slightly different. I do think that's a possibility when it comes to prison labor. I would say, though, in sort of Ancapistan situation, whereby what they're trying to do is trying to pay off a definitive debt, then that's slightly less of an issue. And also the rest of the society wouldn't really complain as much, because they would almost be like free laborers, except they themselves would be subjected, as you mentioned, to very, very high tax rates, essentially, to pay off the debt, and then at which point they'd be free. The interesting point, though, would be if they were there for life. And then it's like, well, what rate would they charge? Now, I suppose you can make the claim in Ancapistan, well, they would charge the market rate and just have like 85% tax rate average, so that they can permanently pay the victims some restitution until they died. Now, I suppose you could claim, well, this is going to encourage families who don't have people they don't like, try to get in situations where they're killed by somebody so they can make money on them. Although I suppose that is possible, but I think somewhat unlikely. So I think if you have prison labor that isn't free as such, and you get other people to pay them outside the system as such, I think the problem you cite with free prison labor and then obviously the close similar situation with slavery, I think you would avoid that problem to some extent.
A follow-up question. What do you make of me reversing the paradigm here? Because a lot of the people who say, oh, the death penalty, that's a barbarous, onerous punishment here. That's inhumane here. What do you make of me reversing the question? So if you notice the episode title here in the document I wrote up is the death penalty more humane than life in mass incarceration or prison labor? Because that's the real thing. That's the real thing. That's the actual thing. Because a lot of, like, the actual, people still have it. Like, I would argue the death penalty would be a better thing for Julian Assange, just in the humane terms here. Again, I want Julian Assange to be free. Just by the way, I want to quickly make that aside here. Although, of course, the regime doesn't want that, so they're gonna try to keep him there as long as possible here. Chelsea Manning was done to a particularly brutal punishment as well, from my understanding. They go pretty hard after the whistleblowers. Now, also, they also, all the January 6th people, they've also been, they have like some. There was one guy that Zero Hedge was reporting on that couldn't get cancer treatment here and now went from stage 1 to stage 3. So again, the mass incarceration system here is pretty brutal here. So now again, if those crimes that wouldn't necessarily be punished in an ideal society, they probably wouldn't even have to happen here. But the more typical murders, rapes, and those things, the things that people have, things like there's a need for them, in a sense, unless you're sort of go hyper forgiveness here, there's a sort of need for them. What do you make of me reversing the paradigm of the question? So the mass incarceration to me looks more brutal here than just, someday you're going to die. The Japanese death penalty, for example, they don't know. The prisoners don't know when it's going to happen, for example. That's I was reading up on this, and for the episode, they don't know when it's going to happen because they will just commit suicide before it'll happen, and they'll view that as a miscarriage of justice. They want the state to do it or the emperor to do it. So they'll make it somewhat random here. And if you look at like third world or second world prisons, they're pretty brutal. So like I wouldn't want to get stuck in there. There's a guy who escaped a Thailand prison. He got stuck with like 100. I'm not sure if he was smuggling cocaine or someone just put in there, but he got stuck there, and he escaped back to Australia eventually on a passport, which was like wired to him, and he was like, I was never so happy to be back in Australia or something like this. So second and third world prisons are fairly brutal. I wouldn't want to get stuck in one of them here. When I flew into Egypt here, apparently I had something in my luggage, not any drugs related, but I was like, yikes, this is gonna go. Hopefully I don't end up here. So there is a certain sense which prisons look pretty brutal here. So I would just argue death is more humane than that. And it's a quick side point here to the other thing. Gary North, as always, has an interesting solution to the problem of people being too litigious, in that if they're going for an entrapment and they're found guilty in the theonomic system, technically, because I think there'd be some amount of people that would have theonomy in the society, in a future society, in pan-anarchist society. Technically, if you accuse someone, like let's say I accuse you of adultery, I would get the punishment for adultery if it's found to be false. Now, again, you could always argue the justice system wouldn't find it to be correct, but then that's just a problem in general. That's not just a problem for here. But if you're found to be innocent of the charges I made towards you, then I have to do it. So then you'd be my slave. So that puts symmetry in there, skin in the game. That sort of balances that problem out here. So with them, and my third question here which I include in the document. I'll just ask it for now. Is the death penalty incompatible with Christianity here? I'll just get the question out of the way. Wouldn't sufficiently brutal mass incarceration be also incompatible? Which sort of relates to me reversing the paradigm of the question, because the general argument you see in the mainstream is, wow, the death penalty, that's an icky, barbarous, medieval punishment. And then saying, what do you do to the people that you don't like? Oh, we lock them in a hole for 23 and a half hours a day with no social thing. Think Julian Assange, think some January 6th protesters, think all those others, think, Chelsea Manning, think of those. That's a pretty brutal punishment. I mean, arguably, the medievalists, like even the skinning the thing the Persian people used to do, that's over in 3 days. That's not 5 years. That's not 10 years. That's over. You're dead in 3 days. It's pretty brutal. I agree. It's pretty brutal. Or being stretched by limb to limb and having or crucifixion. That's over within, I think, 6 to 10 hours. I think. So, you think about the medieval or the ancient punishments. They're not that long spread. I know there's people get locked, spread with sugar on and had bees trample them to death. I know there's various other onerous punishments. But what do you make of? I've sort of asked 3 questions here. Reversing the question, what's the relationship with Christianity? Wouldn't that also be true of mass incarceration? And the quick comment about Gary North. Swithin?
I do think you're right to flip the question, because I do think putting a spotlight on prison as a form of punishment in general is very much worthwhile, particularly if you eventually want to get people back reintegrated in society. Putting them in a situation where it's radically different and you're deprived social contact of various types, it is not really particularly conducive, and then it ends up that the criminals, and to some extent, prefer it being in prison than not in it, so they commit crimes so they can go back in. So I certainly think highlighting that first, and then being able to go, well, okay, we got this bad crime, right, really bad. It's like, okay, well, how do we punish it? And I think it would give a lot more context, because I think people just think, oh no, that penalty is icky. What we do is kind of nice, like just racking them into holes. Gary North's suggestion of entrapments and stuff, I think is a good one. If you're accused of like directly accused of some rape or a situation whereby it's obvious they didn't say, oh, someone stole it and then we found evidence and we think it was you. It was I claim something has happened in a situation whereby I definitely knew you didn't do it, or what I claimed you did to me didn't happen. I do think punishing someone with the same punishment that would have been meted out to the other party if they've been found guilty is entirely reasonable. You could essentially by accusing you of beating me up or something, then which you didn't do. You're threatening me with prison or fines or various things. So I do think that's entirely reasonable. Also, just with prison in general, prison as a form of punishment is relatively recent, is my understanding, at least in the West. I think it starts really in the 18th, 19th century. Because in the 18th century, there was loads and loads and loads of capital crimes, just executed for loads of stuff. Now, whether they were actually executed for them and they could have executed, but they didn't, I'm not sure. But execution was quite widespread. The purpose of imprisonment was making sure you didn't abscond before trial. That was the purpose of prison. It wasn't there as a punishment. It was a holding position before you were brought to trial, which seems to be, if you think you're going to abscond, in some sense reasonable. But it was sort of like an ad hoc, oh no, we'll just keep people in. But as you point out, certain prisons around are deeply, deeply, deeply unpleasant. And as Pete Hitchens has written, and a lot of prisons, he argues, that the criminals run the prison rather than the guards. And they can be particularly brutal if you're in the wrong gang, or you're sort of trying to remain neutral, as it were. You're trying to be Switzerland in Belmarsh. It doesn't go down very well. You have to declare loyalty to one side or another, or you get repeatedly beaten, etc., etc. Also, Peter Hitchens argues, no, I don't know how widespread that is, how often it takes place, whatever. But that is certainly a possibility. I mean, I don't see how you couldn't say that's a possibility. On the accept of Christianity and execution, it does seem to me to be clearly not 100% prohibited. The New Testament one is obvious, Romans 13, the powers, the authorities do not use the sword in vain. It's in the context of basically capital punishment. And then a more clear affirmation of it, Genesis 9, verse 6. Something like, by man shall blood be shed, in the image of God made he man. I can't remember the exact quote. Basically says, if you kill somebody, you should also be killed. And this is given down to Noah after the flood. So it's kind of like a pre sort of Jewish sort of context, and as part of the new sort of paradigm post-flood. Now, that's at least how, narratively speaking, it works within Genesis. So I don't really see any. I don't see any basis for opposing capital punishment on a biblical basis. Now, there's arguments that, well, now in the modern legal system we can do things differently. So I mean, so certain people would take that. Well, I think Aquinas argues that one of the reasons capital punishment is just is that you prevent any future threats to society, and it's really like self-defense rather than this is just the just punishment. Now, there may be more to Aquinas. I'm no expert on his thought, but then that begs the question, well, is actually life in prison actually that nice? Is it actually good? And if it is too nice, is it too expensive, etc.? So, I mean, you have this kind of, if you point out, your sliding scale. I mean, you can either make prison almost like not being in prison, and it's not really punishment and it's really expensive, or you put people in prison and it's really, really nasty. And people could be benefited by people actually going to prison because you get free prison labor, etc. I think it belies significant lack of self-reflection on the nature of the existing judicial system, as opposed to any sort of more broad views on, what would constitute just punishment and why. I just think people think it's icky, and therefore, we can't have it because we're civilized now. So yeah, that'd be my my final comments on there. I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you enjoyed this, please share it with your friends and family, and subscribe to us on Podbean and on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibертyshow@gmail.com.